69% of teams that bypass more opponents in a game tend to go on to win the match. So we know it has some sort of statistical relevance on winning a game. If it's a left winger, for example, who is their direct opposition, I know some people do that. You can also add different nuances in terms of the style of the team that they're in or the style of the team that they're against. The most important thing that we measure is the amount of players left between the ball and the goal at every individual action. I don't think you're getting the best out of your analysis team if that's what they're spending their time doing. I think it also kind of increases the literacy a coach has to have from an analysis perspective, from a data perspective. And then each of these three individual factors are put into its own model, and there are different state values that come from that. Because not only is it kind of rich information from a data perspective, I also think of it as a kind of a very easy to understand data point. I think there is a real case to be had in terms of not overwhelming people with data and trying to just plant the seed as opposed to try and hammer things home with long, boring presentations.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today's guest is Rob Rogers. So Rob is currently head of English football operations for German-based football data company Impect. So in this conversation we speak all things football data. So how clubs are using data, what types of data they are receiving. We speak a little about Rob's experience as an analyst and how the role of an analyst has changed and continues to change within a football club. We speak about the importance of data reliability, the collection of data, and also how it's very important to always, take into consideration the different contexts that the data is being viewed from as well. So before we get into the conversation, I want to quickly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And if you do find value from this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Rob. Rob, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, mate?
Very well, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, very good. How's things in Cologne, is it? Cologne where you are?
Exactly, yeah. We tell from my accent, I'm not originally from here, but yeah, for 5 years now, I've lived over here in Cologne.
Nice, perfect. Well, I'm excited to talk to you today, Rob, about all things kind of data, different metrics, how clubs are using data, and a little bit about how the role of the analyst has changed and continues to change as well. So, like I always do, Rob, I'm going to start by passing it straight over to you. So for those that don't know who you are, a little bit about yourself and what you're currently doing within sport.
So a good place to start. My name is Rob. I'm head of English football operations at a German event data company called Impect. I started off also as an analyst and pivoted into this role probably about 5 years ago now. And as previously mentioned, I am now probably half German, living over here and basically looking after the English arm of our company.
Yeah, perfect. So so you mentioned you kind of started out as an analyst. We're going to dive into a couple of those roles, but also I think it's a good topic to speak to people like yourself, just to show people that want to work in sport and sports analysis that it's not just about working in a club. There's many different roles that you can have, which you're kind of testament to that as well. So your role is something a little bit different. So we will get into that as well. So what we'll do then, Rob, is we will start with just firstly how did analysis come to be something part of your life? So how did you first get onto analysis? Because from looking at your profile, I can see you did some work experience, which we'll come to in terms of Blackpool, but it doesn't look like you came from a sports degree, unless I'm wrong.
No, and to be quite honest, I suppose I always thought of it as a nice idea to be able to work specifically in football. I guess I was always obsessed with football as a kid, but it was never really a viable option, I suppose, back then. Perhaps showing my age a little bit, there didn't feel like there was too many football specific degrees, and certainly nothing from a analysis point of view. It was probably more to do with sports science, and I would say that I'm less adept on the physical side of things as I am on maybe analysing the game itself. So I did business at university, but quite quickly found out that as much as it seemed like a nice idea, it wasn't really the passion that I had in life, and I wanted to pursue something in football.
Yeah. So were you playing football at a young age? Did you play like Football Manager? And a lot of analysts I speak to started out playing a lot of hours of that. So is that kind of you as well?
I think if I shared from my previous games, there's a little tab that says how long you've spent on the game. It was quite shocking, to be quite honest. I think, many hours and days wasted in some ways playing Football Manager. I think my sister always used to make fun of me and say that I don't even like football. I like looking at tables to do with football. And now I do that for a living. So it's jokes on her. But I played football. I was absolutely mad about it. I guess captain my local team and played at a relatively decent level and still play now over here in Germany. So the love for the game is still there. But I always had an eye on analysing the game, I guess, the way my mind works is quite analytical in terms of looking at things. I always want to know how it happened, how it works, and it kind of always appealed to me to try and use data to understand it. And Football Manager, I guess, as with most analysts, it was the gateway drug, shall we say, into actual analysis of football.
Yeah, definitely. So I said it a second ago in terms of Blackpool. So that was the first kind of, from what I can tell from your profile, Rob, the first kind of foray into a club setting in terms of being an analyst. So what was that an internship to start with? How did that come about, and what was that kind of, what did it look like for you?
Yeah, I suppose whilst I was at university, I was studying at Leeds University. I had a professor called Bill Gerard who had yeah, incredible guy. He did a lot when it comes to business analysis, but he was also sports mad. Worked in a number of different sports actually, including in rugby. I remember as a consultant from a data capacity, but also within football. And it was really in its infancy back then, and it kind of fascinated me that this guy, clearly very accomplished in his field, knew that there was a way in which the game could be improved by the use of data, and it kind of showed me that there was potentially some sort of career in that.
Yeah.
I suppose at the time he was supposed to be showing me that the correct career path was something outside of football, but it really stuck with me that there was definitely something happening in the game. I don't know, but at the same time, a friend of mine, essentially from school, was working at Blackpool and had gone down the academic route of football, and said that there was potential of working there at the club. So I actually started off in the academy, essentially with him, looking at the games, analysing games, clips, and collecting some very rudimentary data at that point, because it was all very new, but it was a really nice grounding, really, to know how it could be used within a professional space.
Yeah. So you were there for around a year, and that was fully with the academy, was it, Rob?
Academy, and then went to help with the first team. I guess without going into too many of the details, it wasn't the best environment, I would say, from a club perspective at the time. So I think the first team was also happy to have help from that perspective. Data was not really the done thing, I would say, back then, but we did collect essentially packing data that we'll, I guess, move on to in a moment. I did my own research on the internet in terms of what data was available. Essentially, what came back was expected goals on top of your kind of your typical possession and everything else you'd probably already see on the TV at that time. And expected goals felt to me interesting, but it was limited in that, it was only a certain amount of shots in a game. It didn't really analyze each individual player, and we wanted to be able to give feedback to players and to analyze individual players' performances. And I read a very poorly translated article about packing from German, but speaking to my friend about it, I think I guess, kind of agreed that this was the best approach without really understanding the work that would go into collecting such data. This at least analysed each individual action in a game and gave you a bit more of a reflection about what actually happened across the entire pitch.
Interesting. So, yeah, we're definitely going to get onto packing in a little while, Rob. So, as well as the time you did at Blackpool, you worked also at what looks like an amateur club as well, in terms of doing some analysis with them. Both of those roles linked, because I wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of working with a limited budget. So, I think both of those are probably would fall into that category in terms of Blackpool, probably the most richest club in the world. And then when you were doing the work with the amateur club, I'm sure they couldn't afford, a lot of equipment, a lot of software, a lot of tech and stuff. So how did you find that working in a very limited budget in terms of that role?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the game has certainly changed from a data budget perspective. I think most professional clubs back then didn't have much of a budget to be able to be using sport tech in any capacity. There's always some sort of provision out there that can allow you to do things. I think, amateur clubs certainly around nowadays, or anybody further down in the pyramid, I think if you don't ask, you don't know. It's worth speaking to different companies and trying to see whether there's a way in which there's a provision to be worked with. I know from experience at Impect, we have a kind of a mission statement to affect the professional game, or at least football in its capacity anyway. And regardless of the budget a club has, we'll actually try and find a way, be outside of a typical pricing structure, to be able to work with them. So, there's always a way in which you can improve what you're doing and improve the process in general with technology. You basically just need to try and research and find out what's the best thing possible for the club.
Okay, so I hope you're enjoying the video so far, but I have a really quick interruption for anybody with an interest in video analysis. So if that's you, please do click the link down below the video for InPlay Online. So just to give a quick overview, because I think it'll be relevant to a lot of people that are watching this particular video. So InPlay Online is a cloud-based video analysis software. So it allows you to tag your videos, and when you've done your tagging, that includes adding labels, adding comments, adding notes and voice notes even, and you can even illustrate and draw over your clip. So if you are an aspiring analyst looking for your job and you want to create a portfolio of work, if you're a scout looking to make your kind of reports a little bit better and more animated, if you're a coach looking to get into analysis a little bit more, then this tool will be great for you because it starts at just £15 a month. So once you've done your analysis, you can add all the clips to different playlists, which can be downloaded and exported offline. You can put them into presentations and also share them to different people within your team. So it comes with a whole bunch of other features, but I'll let you click the link down below if you are interested. As I say, packages start at just £15 a month, so it's a very affordable solution if you are looking for something to help with your video analysis. So that's it for the interruption. Let's get back to the video. Yeah, definitely. So let's kind of talk a little bit about the role of the analyst itself, Rob, because I think from the timelines, I think we're about the same age. I'm 33, nearly 34. Are you about the same as me?
30, yeah. Feel a lot older.
You're a bit young. Oh, okay. You're a little bit younger than me. Okay, so perfect. So because I'm just kind of casting my mind back to kind of when I was kind of coming through uni and looking to be an analyst, like the role, what it was then to what it is now. So it tended to just be simply, you know, you'd film the game, you'd code the game, you'd watch the opposition, and you'd create a presentation, and it was just do that all the time and do a lot of that. Obviously, that is still very much an important part of the role of the analyst, but there's loads more to it now than what that was back then, and a lot of that comes down to the data as well. So, how have you found kind of the role change over the years, or what's your thoughts on the kind of change in role of the analyst within football?
Yeah, I think it's obviously professionalized now. It's got its own place within the club. I think felt a little bit like an analyst was almost a spare part at times, and historically. And I think there's more time now to do actual analysis. I feel quite jealous at times of people within clubs that they've got a lot of input now from data, from automated processes that will pull out clips for them, and you've actually got more time to do essentially what you're employed to do by giving insights and be able to analyze individual things. So that's only good for the game. I remember probably in the time that I should have spent studying, I spent such a long time collecting data, finding relevant clips to show back. I don't think you're getting the best out of your analysis team if that's what they're spending their time doing. So I think that this is probably the biggest improvement from an analysis perspective in the game today.
Yeah, that's an interesting point actually, because it comes down to kind of internships and the analysts working for free and not getting paid. Because I think a lot of times people say clubs don't see the value in analysts, and I think that's probably is true in the fact that if they are just filming and just coding and just kind of collecting data as you describe it, like they probably think, well, anyone can do that. But with the help of tech and how it has developed, analysts are actually able to actually do more analysis rather than, like you say, just collect data, rather than just code a game or whatever. Pretty much anyone can do that, but in terms of actually using what you've got and then delivering insights and actually analysing the game, then like I say, that should be what you did. But back then it was a case of you'd waste your time on doing a hell of a lot of other boring stuff as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think just in general now, because of the breadth of what is available out there from a sport tech perspective, because my knowledge is more along the data side of things now, but it's so much more professionalized. I think people really expect a less subjective and a more robust framework in which data is delivered and collected, and therefore it kind of shows how far the industry has come, that's almost just a part and parcel of the game now, and you can essentially deliver things out of the box and be able to put your own spin on it as an analyst, which is it's great to see.
Yeah, because I just kind of remember when I first joined kind of Brighton and stuff. I started interning at Sheffield United. I worked under Mike at the first team. So there's like the first team had one analyst. There was like an academy analyst, maybe a couple of interns on a Sunday. And then when I went to Brighton, again, this is sort of 10 years ago, so it's a long time ago, but that kind of blew me away in terms of seeing their department back then, where they had they actually had a team of analysts, and it was kind of like, wow, like what do all you people do kind of thing. But then you kind of get to know that there's just so much that can be done. So everyone does have a lot to do. And we see it now with loads of different roles in terms of what was traditionally the first team analyst role. You now have opposition analysts, recruitment analysts, data analysts, set piece analysts, everything. So there's so much more to do because, well, in part because of the extra data that clubs are now getting access to, and they need people to be able to kind of work with that and get insights from that. So in terms, because again, it links back to the coach analyst role. So I suppose that's the same kind of topic there, Rob. So what's your thoughts on the coach analyst role? Obviously, we're seeing more of that at the moment in terms of clubs employing that rather than, is that like kind of would you see that as a go-between between the traditional analyst and a coach on the grass?
Yeah, I think it's a really significant step, to be quite honest, for the industry, because it kind of normalizes it within the environment of a training ground. And I think, yeah, these roles tend to have different applications. I wouldn't say it's the same in every single club from what we've seen, but I think it's a really it's a great thing to be able to bring that analysis to life within, I guess, the realm of the decision makers. Ultimately, the coach, the manager, should be able to be the one to get these insights. I think having a coach analyst kind of allows you to communicate it better to those decision makers and hopefully have some sort of impact on how a team is trained or how decisions are made, setting up on the pitch. I think it also kind of increases the literacy a coach has to have from a analysis perspective, from a data perspective. Generally now most coaches will at least be able to fire up a laptop and look at some things, but we've really, now got people who probably started more on the analysis side of things and have transitioned into coaching, which I certainly didn't see 15 years ago coming into the space. So it's really quite nice to be able to see that this is where we are now.
Yeah, that is true, because again, going back to kind of my experiences was at Sheffield United, the coaches at the time, I had a few different kind of first team coaches, but they didn't tend to have like say software and they didn't tend to, that was like the analyst job, and if they were needed out, they'd go to the analyst. But then at Brighton, then when we'd get in like sort of the foreign coaches would come in, it was kind of second nature to them. I found anyway. Obviously everyone is different, but they'd come in and they were all competent on, they'd want to code the game themselves. They'd also want to look at it. So they were, like I say, they were already kind of more towards that kind of coach analyst, but I suppose that may be how they learned as a coach in a different country or whatever. So yeah, really, really interesting. So let's kind of jump to Impect then, a little bit more on where you were kind of working now then, Rob, in terms of all I know so far is data company. So can you give us some more background, what the company's about, what you currently do?
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that. I think we don't do too much marketing, so most people either don't know we exist or just know that we're a data company. So I would say we are an event data company from Germany, based here in Cologne. We essentially provide rich event data that includes a method called packing. We do that for over 130 competitions worldwide. So we kind of have a large range of data that we now provide to different clubs for recruitment or for analysis. I would say that probably we were founded by two former players, and that's what sets us apart from most within the industry. So Jens Hegler and Stefan Reinhardt, they both played football obviously together at Bayer Leverkusen, and they were being assessed on quite basic data at the time. It was your possession of the team, distance covered, dual win rate, pass completion, the stuff you probably see more on Match of the Day or something like that nowadays, or even Match of the Day's come a lot further, it seems like, in the last couple of years. And this stuff was basically stuck on the dressing room wall, and it was somehow used to assess the players and benchmark them. And they didn't really feel like that gave them a true reflection of how they played in a game. So yeah, around about the same time, they were invited to a debate at the Sports University of Cologne here. Quite a significant university, I think, from a sport perspective in the country, probably the top one. And the head of data from the university essentially attended the debate. And when football came along, Stefan and Jens essentially gave their view of how data was used within the top level of the game, assuming that by Leverkusen it would be groundbreaking, probably the cutting edge. But the head of data essentially said that none of the data that you're actually using really tells a picture of what happened in the game. He used correlation to the end result to essentially benchmark how significant the data was. And as we all know now, you don't really need possession necessarily to win a football match. So that was the origin point for Stefan and Jens to try and measure the game in a different way. They developed this technique called packing. Packing itself, I guess, it's just a name for our data set within the English speaking world. I know it's been taken as kind of line breaking passing, which, kind of good and bad in some ways. I wasn't brought up to keep the ball on the floor and to break lines. I was brought up to win the ball back out the pitch and kick it long. Packing measures that as well. Essentially, the most important thing that we measure is the amount of players left between the ball and the goal at every individual action. This allows us to evaluate not only a pass being a completed pass or being a forward pass, but also how many players were taken out of the game with that pass. In the same way we would measure a interception, we wouldn't just say, okay, it was an interception that happened here on the pitch. We would say this interception took 5 opposition players out of the game because they're no longer goal side.
Mhm.
So it allows you to evaluate essentially within the opposition's formation how effective this individual action has been and provide what we believe to be quite crucial footballing context into the situation, as opposed to just measuring things and treating the pitch like some sort of graph.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'd actually remember when I first heard about this, and when it was first started, because I would have been because about 10-year-old the company, is it? I think, is it about 10 years old?
Yeah, so it's about 2014 time that Stephanie Jens had the idea. They partnered with the sports university and they had students doing it, but it was about, I would say, 5 years ago now that we moved to the Philippines for the data collection. We now have over 350 people on last check, maybe even more, collecting the data full time.
Yeah.
So I'd say for 10 years, it's been a concept. For 5 years, it's been a real company.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm sure, I mean, I didn't think of it at the time, but I can remember being at Brighton, and that was 10 years ago, and I read something about this kind of new stat that was effectively, like, say, kind of, it tells you how many line breaking passes and stuff like that, and I just remember it being, oh, that's quite interesting, and then I never really thought of it after that because I'd left Brighton and stuff, but yeah, cool. It's interesting how it kind of crossed my path early on. So perfect. So you talked a little bit about packing data there. So just in its most basic form then, Rob, like, why... Can you just explain in a little bit more detail in terms of why that would be useful? So for you to know, I make a pass into a striker and it takes out 5 players, why would that be useful? And why are teams kind of using that data, or in what way are they using it mostly?
I think it's a double-pronged thing, and perhaps that's too simplistic, but for me, that there's 2 main reasons as to why it's useful. First of all, it has a statistical relevance. We've used that approach that essentially was thrown to Stefan and Jens in the first place to show why the data that was being used to assess them was not significant. And we actually test all of our data now to see whether it has a correlation to the end result. Yeah. So 69% of teams that bypass more opponents in a game tend to go on to win the match. So we know it has some sort of statistical relevance on winning a game. Yeah. Obviously, we can go into slightly more detail in terms of which players you take out of the game, and that's nice. And we will speak about that in a moment. But I think the other part of this is kind of the ease of communication of the idea of packing, because not only is it kind of rich information from a data perspective, I also think of it as a kind of a very easy to understand data point. I'm sure we'll get onto the idea of like expected threat and possession value models and this type of thing. That's all well and good from somebody who's come from a data background. Yeah. When you're trying to explain to a player, a coach who was, formerly a player or maybe had no background in data, or even an owner, the general concept of some of these things, it's very difficult to get the point across, and that tends to be the job of an analyst in many ways, to actually be able to communicate what they found, not only to find out. Packing, talking about players taken out of the game, it's just a concept used by people who like data, who don't like data. They kind of are unaware that it's data at all. It's just spoken about across training grounds and football clubs across the country, and therefore I always think it's a very nice gateway into actually understanding the game from a data point of view without really knowing you're using data.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, definitely. So, and then you mentioned, I think you said a second ago, how many kind of countries and clubs, like what kind of clients are you working with then, Rob? Is that kind of like Premier League clubs, like kind of all around the world? Like what does that look like? And is it just clubs? Is it organizations? Is it media and stuff like that?
I think but I suppose the main market is clubs. We've focused on the professional game, so to speak. We don't really work with the media or anything like this. I think the approach from the company is that innovation comes within the professional space, and as much as it's nice to be able to put sort of basic data up on the screen for the media, that doesn't really drive innovation. I guess most people have been comfortable with seeing the same statistics there for many years. So clubs and associations and federations, I guess, is our market. We work with over 100 clubs and associations across the world now, and I'd say we're probably most popular still in Germany, as you can imagine. I think it's 15 of 18 Bundesliga clubs that we use this for analysis or recruitment, or both. But I mean, it's used up and down the pyramid. Premier League clubs to National League clubs in the UK. We go down to, I think, the 5th tier in Germany, and it's a very flat structure over here. I think I've played in the 7th tier, I think, which I've got to tell you is not a very high standard. So it can be used by essentially any club. no matter how adept they are at actually using data.
Yeah. And what's your specific role then? Are you overseeing you mentioned you're kind of head of English football, so are you overseeing the clients within England? Are you dealing with analysts day to day, or how does that look?
Yeah, and I guess English speaking as well. So analysts day to day, I guess it really depends on who is using the data within the club. Different clubs see using it in different ways, and I guess we're not really there to dictate what best practice is most of the time.
Yeah.
So it can be a video analyst, there will be data scientists that will get help from us. There will be coaches, heads of recruitment. I guess the list is endless in terms of who believes they can get use from the data. I'm probably a believer that the biggest value add will come from recruitment with the data. Although having an overall game model for the club and being able to include your coaches and maybe director of football into that is obviously a very important aspect. But yeah, it changes day to day absolutely in terms of who we deal with and who we speak with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, would you be able to kind of just broadly, would you say more clubs are using it for recruitment than for performance? And if so, what would the split potentially be? Or is it just kind of even Stevens almost?
Yeah, I would say probably a 60-40 split from recruitment. I don't have any detailed numbers,
Yeah,
but just
yeah,
based on what I feel. I think clubs who sing off the same hymn sheet, who use it for both, tend to be the ones that get the most value for things, because I'm sure people who've worked in recruitment departments have had that battle before of identifying a target, but then trying to communicate it to the coaching staff, specifically the manager, who certainly should have some sort of buy-in in terms of whether they want a player, and not being able to communicate why they think that player is good.
yeah,
If they're also aware of the data and they're using it to assess first team players, of course, that's a really nice way to be able to say, look, our left back only takes so many players out of the game. This guy, we believe, could increase that quite significantly. But yeah, it really varies, and different clubs have got different levels of buy-in across the board.
Mm. And I just want to ask you about the amount of data in general, Rob. Really, so this kind of goes back to a conversation I had with another Rob Sudderbeams at FIFA, in terms of the kind of our clubs kind of getting more data than they know what to do with, and some, obviously the elite clubs will have huge data teams and they will be getting a lot from it, but I think there will still be a lot of clubs that are getting a lot of data, but they're probably only scraping the surface with the stuff that they can do with it, whether that's a skills gap, whether it's just they don't have enough personnel, or they just don't know what to do with it, basically. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I agree to some extent. It really depends. I think clubs can get a lot of use out of data regardless of how much is delivered to them. We don't really have like a kind of a light data set where we only deliver a certain amount of KPIs to them. They'll get everything, so to speak. It's just being able to kind of identify what's useful to them. So some clubs who have massive teams that are able to access data from our API and kind of build things themselves based on our data feed is, that's really nice for them. They can sift through reams and reams of data and find out what's relevant to them. We've also kind of tried to make sure that we've got some really easily accessible platforms. So one specifically for scouting, one specifically for analysis, that kind of gives you, I'd say 90% of the value of what you could get from using the API, and kind of delivers it in a way that's already easily accessible and understandable. Because we're big believers that there shouldn't be any kind of gatekeeping to data. It should be understandable by everybody, and regardless as to whether a club really has employed a data scientist or an expert with it, somebody should be able to log on and understand how they're measuring their own performances, or how they're trying to find the best player based on any player profile that they've created. So to a certain extent, yes, but providing they have the right guidance of what data to use, any club can get good use out of data regardless of whether they've got a data team in place, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video, you must be enjoying the content. Either that, or you have simply fallen asleep. So whichever one of them it is, you probably won't mind me asking you for a quick favour. So as you know, I'm always looking to grow the channel. So the bigger the channel gets, the more people we can reach and impact, but also the bigger and better guests we can invite on to the channel to have these types of chats. So with that in mind, if you haven't already done so, I would very much appreciate it if you did hit the subscribe button down below the video. The stats are showing around 25% of viewers are subscribed. So there's a big chunk of you that are watching the videos, but you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, but I will let you off because you can do it right now. It's free and it literally takes 1 second. So if you go down, click the subscribe button, it would mean a lot to the channel and help the channel to grow. So that's all for now. Let's get back to the video. Yeah, interesting. So obviously, there's different data providers out there. We don't need to name them. There's plenty out there. I just want to, what's your kind of perspective on, say there's three different data providers. Is it mainly what differentiates kind of you guys to another data provider? Like, is it just the platform and maybe some metrics, or is it all pretty similar at this stage? Or, just kind of, you're in the landscape a lot more than me in terms of the providing clubs, really. Just what do you think on
I
that?
think right now it's I suppose quite a hot topic, and yeah, I suppose there's a few different things that differentiate providers. Probably first of all, it's best to mention that we're an event data provider. So
Yeah,
we look at different events that happen in the game. There are other tracking data providers or providers of numerous different types of data. It kind of comes in all different shapes and sizes, but we look at each individual event that happens on the pitch. I would always say that it really then kind of comes down to a question of data quality and data depth.
yeah,
Yeah, the data quality really matters, and whether you're trying to understand it from a performance perspective or a recruitment perspective, I suppose we've all watched video with data included and seen that the player is tagged wrong, or it just doesn't make any sense.
yeah,
You're making decisions on that, and therefore we try to differentiate ourselves from being kind of the premium data provider in the market. I often refer back to an acronym. A guy called Dominic Jordan, he used to be head of data at Manchester United, spoke about, and that was ABCDE:
mm,
accuracy of the data. So essentially, how accurate is it that your tagging team is able to identify different individual actions?
yeah,
The breadth of the data, what competitions or what leagues are you covering? The consistency of the data. This is a big topic. I think that the kind of has changed within the industry. A previous approach to collecting data was more of a subjective idea of, okay, historically, I will tell my data tagging team to interpret crosses and say, this is a cross.
yeah,
We don't do that. We used a rule-based approach to create our crosses by saying, okay, they have to be uniform across the board. They have to be consistent. We have to say, if an action starts here, ends here, and reaches a certain height, for example, it must have been a cross.
yeah,
Because when you open the door for yeah, subjectivity and human error,
yeah,
they might say, well, I know that was Luke Shaw, therefore he was obviously trying to cross the ball there.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's not a nice thing for them to be able to bend the rules. So
yeah,
consistency is also a really important part of it. D is the depth of the data, and E is essentially the execution. But I suppose from where we differentiate ourselves, we would say that our data is more accurate. We cover a large amount of leagues now, certainly from the point in which I started. It's incredible the amount of leagues you can scout in with data,
mm,
and making it consistent across the board is, without a doubt, really high value. So much so that you really wouldn't believe sometimes the areas that you see in data when testing them against each other.
mm, yeah. Yeah, because I think it was Tim Keach, who's also been on. So he's kind of from Market Insights, which is a kind of consultancy, which is another thing we're seeing a lot of, where clubs are leaning on consultancies as well, with the use of whether it be Impect data or any other data. So if they haven't got the full team in house, they can lean on these. And it was an interesting point. He said kind of, there's loads of these kind of popping up, and it seems like there's more than there is demand almost. Whereas all of these consultancies are coming up, and I think they're just kind of riding the wave of the amount of data that is available to clubs, and kind of just help them out in different ways, I suppose. But yeah, it seems to be a busy sector at the moment. Obviously, always kind of growing. So So we mentioned kind of packing a little bit there. So let's kind of jump to another metric if we can, Rob. So again, I think you've said it yourself in terms of expected threat. Just for those that are watching, might be interested. I know a lot of people have heard of expected goals. Pretty simple as to what that is at this point. So expected threat. Can you kind of go into that a little bit, Robbie?
Yeah. So expected threat, it's a possession value model. There are actually many different possession value models on the market. Expected threat is essentially just one of them. It's a Markov approach. It's essentially how the model is put together. But it essentially started off with somebody called Karun Singh, who now works at Arsenal. He popularized the idea of expected threat, kind of brought it into the wider community. I think possession value models in general have been around for a little bit longer. I think some of the forerunners to the use of data in football were well ahead of the game. They didn't really let that out to the public domain because they had some sort of edge with that. But essentially, if we can explain expected threat or possession value models in general, it essentially assesses the value of each individual action in a match. in regards to the chance of scoring a goal, and it tends to use historical data to model that. So previously, when an action has been in this scenario, how likely is it that a goal can be scored?
Yeah.
And each action is essentially evaluated with different data points that are collected, such as the distance to the goal. I guess generally speaking, an action that happens within 15 meters of goal will tend to have a higher chance of score and a greater threat than an action that happens 60 meters from goal. I have then sort of the urge to talk about what goes into the model, because I tend to equate it to like cooking a good dish.
Yeah, go for it.
As
I want to
stupid as
hear
that
about
sounds.
it. Yeah, go for it. Go for
Um,
it.
it doesn't matter if you employ a Michelin star chef to create the best possible recipe and cook the dish for you. If the ingredients that you put into it are, from the local corner shop, you're probably not going to get the best of meals.
Yeah.
So it kind of doesn't matter how advanced the model is if you're not putting the best parameters and information into it. And kind of where we tend to differentiate our possession value model, we call it packing expected threat. It kind of combines that packing idea that we mentioned at first with the expected threat model.
Yeah.
And we include the distance to goal, like pretty much every other model. We also include the players that are between the ball and the goal. It's a really significant factor. There's a real difference being 50 meters from goal against Manchester City than there is against Everton being 50 meters from goal. You've probably got 10 players left to beat, as opposed to maybe you threw in a one-on-one. And also the pressure. And different models have different approaches to pressure. I think ours is the only one that has essentially 3 different categories of pressure. We scale pressure from a 0 to 100% range. And then each of these 3 individual factors are put into its own model, and there are different state values that come from that. And each of them essentially tell you how likely a team is to score a goal after a certain event. So based on the pressure, the distance, and the players up between the ball and the goal.
Interesting. Nice. So on that was about a little bit about context, which I think we'll kind of jump into next, or it leads in nicely. So in terms of all the data that clubs are kind of interpreting and kind of looking at, it is very important to kind of look at it in the context. And by that I mean kind of phases of play, like the location on the pitch, which you mentioned there, the state of the game. So if you can, Rob, can you talk a little bit around why it's important to kind of understand the context that the data is kind of collected and being shown in?
Yeah, so context is king. I guess we always say that, and it really is kind of key to understand data. It's one thing collecting information, but being able to contextualize it to the people who need to make the decisions is kind of where the value add can be made. Context in football comes in many different forms. You've mentioned some of them there. I think it's sometimes quite frustrating to see people make points without really adding context. I think one of the usual tropes is looking at things like pass completion rates. Trent Alexander-Arnold's got one of the lowest pass completion rates in the Premier League. So what? He progresses the ball better than pretty much anybody in the game. So you kind of have to make a decision based on the context that he's actually pretty good at doing that. And another one is kind of about the idea of what was that other stat that Van Dijk had not been dribbled past for 18 months, and then you look at how often he was actually taken on as a player, and it was very rare. So I think by adding each of these individual context variables, as we call them, the phase of play that something happens in, the pitch location, you can kind of specify it to the team and add a bit more of a nuanced view of what's actually going on in the game. I think maybe to pick up on the idea of pitch location is very useful, and I think everybody's kind of used to the idea now of touches in the box, touch in the final third. I'm sure everyone's seen a heat map from time to time, and it provides a decent layer of context, I would say. But similar to the theme that I mentioned before, I think it misses a lot of the context. We say, in general, the pitch is often defined by the opposition.
Yeah.
So we develop this general idea called packing zones, which tries to take into account essentially where you are within the opposition, as opposed to just using the original pitch location. I wonder whether it's worth just sharing a touch about that.
Go for it, Rob. I think that would be good to kind of visualize it. I think because what I'm getting from that is, so let's say like if I'm an attacker, I'm between the lines of the defensive midfield. That's going to look, I could be in a completely different location if I'm between the lines of a Man City defense and midfield or Everton, as you've used those teams before. So it's kind of in relation to the opposition. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So I guess this is a quite a crude visualization of it, but this is how we kind of break it down versus, for example, a 4-2-3-1. It changes depending on the formation of the opposition. But as opposed to just using the pitch markings and saying it's happening in the opposition box or in the final third, we will essentially say it's happening between the opposition centre backs and midfield, for example, in what we would call the attacking midfield zone. And it's really then nice to be able to add a profile to a player, as opposed to saying you have a striker. You can say you have a striker that runs the channels and gets in behind the opposition right back and right centre back, for example, in what we call the in behind wide left zone. I guess to kind of show how it actually works, they have to be dynamic. They have to be fluid because the opposition moves. So if we knock the ball to our right back and the opposition kind of moves over it their own way in their own pace, some of the zones will move based on that. It's, I guess, an approach based on where the opposition are. I wondered if it was also just worth showing a kind of a realistic example of how we would visualize that and how clubs would kind of see it.
Definitely. So just on that, before in terms of the different formations, then, Rob, so you would have those zones would be identified differently. You'd have different packing zones for if you're playing a 4-2-3-1, if you're against a 5-4-1, if you're against a 4-4-2. So is that, and what happens if the team that you're playing against is fluid in their formations and they change the second half to play different? Would that then reflect in the data that you provide in terms of those zones would have switched?
Yeah, I guess that kind of, it comes back to the original point of it depends on who's collecting your data and kind of the accuracy involved. So our data providers have to identify when formations have changed. They have to understand what's happened. If a formation has moved throughout the game, it will obviously affect the packing zone. So it depends on the formation that they're playing, and it's quite an interesting thing. But things like set pieces, it's not really very useful. It's kind of there, you kind of make a cut when it comes to that phase of play of set pieces. But in general possession and transitional phases, it's very, very useful to understand the context of what's happening in the game. I thought it would be quite a nice one to be able to show within our scouting platform, because, hopefully there's no England fans who have a kind of a bad memory of this. But if I share this here, this is just a part of our scouting platform. It's comparing two, as we would call them, offensive midfielders, I guess, players that played across the attack or number 10 role during the Euros. And we're essentially looking at their average touches in each of these packing zones in each of the games. That's at the moment total touches. We can then break it down into just offensive, so on the ball as opposed to defensive, comparing. I think did he win player of the tournament in the end, Nico Williams?
He may well have done, I think.
He played well, shall we say that, compared to a Phil Foden. Phil Foden, generally starting on the left, was far more likely to receive the ball and do things from deeper areas, the fullback zone at times, coming inside centrally, but very rarely being able to get on the ball in behind the opposition defence. These in behind zones are essentially in behind the opposition defence. Nico Williams received the ball far more often higher up the pitch, and almost once per game got in behind the opposition right back as a left winger, which is probably a large part as to why they were very strong in what they were doing. I think on average, if you looked at the total touches of each of the players, Phil Foden was often receiving the ball and touching the ball higher up the pitch when it came to the pitch location. Nico Williams, however, was in an area that was actually beyond the opposition defence. So when trying to measure penetration, you can't really get that from the pitch location. That's where the idea of packing zones comes in. Obviously, if you wanted to look at it for a game model perspective, or even from a recruitment perspective, it would be nice to also be able to say, we don't just want to sign a left winger, we want a left winger that will run in behind, and try and profile it based on this. So it may be a very short snippet in terms of how that will be used.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's really good. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Rob. So I suppose the context comes down to also it's linked to scouting as well. To a recent episode I did with Liam Henshaw in terms of the scouting view of things, where if you're going to watch a player, you do want to see them in different contexts, and that will similar types of things. So you want to see them home and away. You want to see them against a team with a lot of possession, against a team that they're going to struggle against. Different game states and stuff. So just kind of seeing the data, whether that be visual on video or number data in different contexts, is very important. Is that what you? Because I know you maybe not personally, Rob, but you guys are at the Training Ground Guru recently event. Was that kind of what that you spoke about in terms of the context there? What was that about? If you were part of that, I don't know if you know much about that.
No, I was part of it, but I think 2 days before the event, I became a father, and
that's it. Yeah. So, congratulations on that. So that made you miss. Yeah, okay, perfect. So how was how was being a father, I suppose. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Different than interpretive football data, shall we say? But it's going very well. I was involved, I guess, in the planning of the presentation. We spoke a little bit about adding the context to different scenarios. I think packing zones came up, for example. But yeah, I think from what I understand, it was a really nice event. I'd say, but based on what you mentioned in terms of trying to interpret from a recruitment perspective, what's relevant for a club, it's always important to try and add a little bit of information about who a player is playing against. There's different approaches to that. You can look at, if it's a left winger, for example, who was their direct opposition. I know some people do that, and say, what was the standard of the right back they were up against. You can also add different nuances in terms of the style of the team that they're in, or the style of the team that they're against. In our platform, we tend to allow clubs to be able to do that kind of as they will. They can say, okay, just show me the performances of that player from a data perspective against these possession-based teams.
Yeah.
But I think probably the most powerful way in which we do it is to try and look at the standard of the opposition as a whole. We have a model called the Impect squad ratings that essentially benchmarks every team that we collect data on, and it has actually very little to do with Impect data as a whole. We look at the closing line of the betting market, and we model from that, essentially similar to an ELO ranking, if anybody's used it, the standard of the team. And from this, we use cross-competition analysis to build an overall worldwide league table, with the general idea that, as opposed to just saying, okay, that player is playing well in the Eredivisie, we probably want to know how they're playing against teams in the Eredivisie that might be at a Premier League standard, because we're a Premier League club.
Yeah.
And therefore, no disrespect to ADO Den Haag or any of these kind of lower end Eredivisie clubs, being in the Premier League, a performance against those clubs doesn't really give you too much context about how they would perform.
Yeah.
You want to see how they were performing against Ajax, Feyenoord, AZ Alkmaar, PSV, etc. So that is a really nice way to be able to use data to kind of narrow down what you would watch from a recruitment perspective, and understand which players are kind of fitting the profile in teams where you might actually play against a similar standard of.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing you did say was the kind of packing zones are more so for like the in possession, so not set plays. But I just want to ask you a little bit about kind of set pieces and the data around that, Rob. I don't know if you can kind of riff on that a little bit in terms of what kind of data is provided by Impact then on the set plays. Like, can you go into a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really topical thing, actually. So just released kind of a set piece module within the platform. Unfortunately, I wasn't really instrumental in putting it together, and my knowledge of set pieces probably aren't the highest within the company. But from what I understand from the product development team, it's such an incredible world, because I think as a sport, we love it because it's so dynamic, because it's so fluid. It's very difficult to be able to break things down into different areas that we can analyze that are similar in other games. With set pieces, you can kind of do that. I guess the big one people talk about is from a corner. There are some certainties that will happen. A player will probably put the ball into the box or have some sort of variation of kicking the ball from that area. And you can put things into different buckets in terms of saying, okay, this was a cross to the near post, this was an in-swinger to the far post. And we've essentially created maybe a slightly more intuitive way of measuring that, I would say, as opposed to the typical approach to using data for corners, for example, would be to split the box up into different smaller boxes.
Yeah.
And I know that's something that I did back when I was trying to collect data. I guess is the kind of the obvious way of doing things. But when we asked people who actually work as set piece coaches, they would often group these boxes together and say they are the near post. And then when we asked them, well, how would you kind of really interpret the near post? Where would that be delivered? They said, well, it'll probably be an area similar to this. And we've actually kind of created shapes based on what they believe each individual category should be, as opposed to just drawing boxes for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And therefore we can kind of identify which area the ball has been delivered to in maybe a little bit more of a contextual way. And then the big advantage of that is visualizing it. So we've got essentially on the platform a way of looking at the sequence of actions, where the ball was delivered, whether there was a first contact. You can then filter for who gets the first contact, and then what eventually happens, whether it goes into the goal. Obviously, then you can link that up with video, and I would say it would make the job of a set piece analyst or coach a lot easier in the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. I will say anyone with an interest in set plays, I had Stuart on this podcast, I don't know when, a few months back, but that's a really interesting episode. He's a kind of freelance set piece analyst, and yeah, until you get into it, I think you don't really realize how much goes into kind of a corner or whatever. We're seeing, it is quite topical, isn't it, at the moment? You're seeing even like the set piece coaches are kind of getting some airtime on Sky Sports and stuff like that, on the side of on the dugouts and stuff. So it does seem like people are taking note. But in terms of, like you mentioned, the delivery zone, but also, like say, is it an in-swinger, is it an out-swinger, is it high, is it driven, is it low, is it short, there's loads of stuff to kind of consider. So yeah, that's really interesting. So I want to ask you, Rob, if you, in terms of just looking forward, in terms of the future of kind of sports data, like, is there anything that's kind of taking your fancy at the moment? Any predictions you might have? Anything that you may see coming in the next few years? I don't know if you think much about this at all.
Yeah. It's an ever evolving industry, and I guess we've always kind of got to bear in mind what innovation has already been done, and I think there's maybe a slight disconnect in terms of what's being implemented at clubs and what is already possible. I
Mm,
guess the wheels of change turn quite slowly.
yeah.
I would certainly say tracking data in general will probably be one of the keys. The availability of tracking data is low, I would say, at the moment for most clubs. Obviously, there's different forms of tracking data. You can have a sort of an in-house tracking data system, which will give you very accurate information, and you can also get broadcast tracking, which varies in its quality. I would say I would believe that probably technology will get to the point where broadcast tracking will be possible to be used for a large amount of competitions, and there from a recruitment perspective, you can start to implement things like broadcast tracking into any strategy analyzing a player. And yeah, I think in general the combination of data and video will probably become a little bit more adopted within the world at this moment in time. And that, in the end of the day, is probably the best way of contextualizing things. So I can imagine that will also be probably one of the bigger things to come. I guess it's being done in a rather basic way at this moment in time, and the more people kind of learn about how that can essentially save them time now, the more it will be adopted within clubs. I think just in general as well, the wider world of football is kind of understanding more about data, and it's quite astonishing now to see Monday Night Football or the equivalent here in Germany. They go into an incredible amount of detail that sometimes
Yeah.
when you see a club they are still somewhat ignorant to, and because of the general data literacy of the average football fan nowadays, it's driving the sport forward and kind of forcing it to change, because there's people who put things on the internet that at times you would question whether they would actually know a bit more than some within clubs. Not to say
Yeah.
there are many clubs like that nowadays, but I can only imagine that increasing. I guess the world of football analytics online has kind of started this revolution, so to speak, and I hope that continues, because that has tended to be where a lot of the innovation has come from.
Yeah, definitely. So, I want to ask you about advice for kind of people wanting to work in sports, and whether it's to be an analyst, whether it's just to be in, work in sports analytics. Rob, can you share any words of wisdom for anyone listening that relates to?
Yeah, I would say probably two separate things. First of all, learning to code in some way is just massive. I think you almost need to do it now to be able to add value,
Yeah,
because generally I think the younger generation, it will just become the norm. It's becoming part of general normal school curriculums. It makes
yeah,
me very jealous, because trying to pick that up now is quite difficult. I guess we all coded in some way in terms of understanding what happens in a game, but then being able to automate processes in the long run. It's such a massive value add, because in a club environment, I count myself quite lucky being on the outside.
mm,
I think it can be very, very difficult to manage your hours and be able to cover all the things that you need to do within a club. So
yeah,
if you can code and automate some of the things that you need to do, so it allows you to actually have some free time, or at least be able
yeah,
to provide insights. That's something I can't stress enough in terms of how important it will be. And then probably the most important one I would say is, as an analyst, perfect your communication skills.
mm,
Understand how important it is to kind of communicate to everybody within a club. Detail is all well and good, and I think generally people who are analysts want to go into a lot of detail, but when you're in a Saturday Wednesday type rhythm, or actually they call it over here in Germany an English week, when you have to play two games in a week, or even just week to week, if it's each weekend, you get very little time to go into the detail that you need to do, and in the end, when you feed back to a coach or to players, it's going to be just a few small points that you need to hammer home.
yeah,
So understand how to deliver that key info to the key decision makers, whether they're from a data background, a footballing background. I would also say that your data visualization is really important there. Almost less is more at times, but try and make it as clear and as understandable as possible. I think there is a real case to be had in terms of not overwhelming people with data and trying to just plant the seed, as opposed to try and hammer things home with long, boring presentations.
mm. Yeah, that's quite topical because I don't know, it probably will be out by the time this video comes out. So I will have done a video in the last few weeks with Andy Kirk, who's a data visualization expert, and I was so interested to learn about the different things that go into a visualization. So yeah, if anyone wants to check that out, I'll link that down below. But yeah, also on the kind of advice kind of front, Rob, in terms of people trying to get started, is there any kind of data that Impact make available at all for people that just want to kind of play around with things and just trying to get dip the toe into that? Is there anything like that at all?
Yeah, I suppose not typically out there in the industry at the moment. We've not really been giving free data away from historically, but I think it's something we're kind of willing to do now. So I would say watch this space. There'll probably be something in the public domain,
Nice.
or get in touch with me. I'm sure we'll be able to find a way. We're very happy to help people start on the data journey and kind of get up and running. Yeah, just we'd be more than happy to be
Nice.
able to share something.
Perfect. Nice. So I'll link a couple of episodes that we've spoke about. They'll be linked down below. I'll link the website down below so people can go on there, find out more. And obviously, you've said they can reach out to you, Rob. So you're on LinkedIn. So I'm sure most people that watch this will be on LinkedIn. So hopefully they can find you on there, Rob. Is there anything else you want to give a shout out to? In fact, one thing I don't know. Are you a reader, Rob? Do you have any book recommendations? I do normally ask that to my guests. I don't know if it doesn't have to be a sports analysis book. It can be anything that you've consumed. If you are a reader, that is.
I showed you my bookcase just over there to the right hand side. Unfortunately, it's consumed with sport. I'm a bit sad from that perspective. But no, I'd say just in general, Inverting the Pyramid by Jonathan Wilson.
Hmm.
Just anything in general by Jonathan Wilson. But I think this is it's such an essential book. It was so formative for me in the journey of understanding football. It kind of sets out that idea that football is very cyclical in its nature, and you need to understand how the game has evolved historically. Similar with data, you need to look at things historically to understand what might come in the future and allow you to innovate. And maybe more specific to data, I guess, come up relatively recently. There's a book by Ian Graham, How to Win the Premier League. Yeah, I think it's a really good blend, to be quite honest, of
Hmm.
some actual really insightful ideas of how data is used within a professional environment, and a very strong professional environment, and at Liverpool.
Yeah.
But also, I think it kind of, yeah, it tells a nice story. It's also a very good read. It gives you a real understanding of how things are done at the professional level without having too much of a background of data needed to understand what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I've not read that yet. I mean, he must be doing all right with the book sales because every last previous guest always mentions Ian's book. So I need to check that one out. Perfect. So anything else you want to give a shout out to at all?
I don't suppose I need to. Certainly nothing that I've prepared. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Chris. And
Yeah, no problem.
yeah, look forward to seeing the episode.
Yeah, no, sure. In fact, before I go, I want to ask you. I haven't actually asked you this yet. Being living in Cologne for kind of coming on 5 years, can you speak any German, Rob?
Yeah, kann ich Deutsch sprechen, ja, natürlich.
Oh, nice. I don't know,
Yes,
no
of
idea
course I can.
that.
Well, apparently with a very unfortunate English accent, apparently.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a little bit frustrating because if they hear an English accent, people in Germany tend to speak tend to speak English very
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
and they will switch into English, I
Yeah.
guess, out of common courtesy, or even perhaps it's because my German is not very good.
Mm.
But now you need it to get by, and therefore have a German wife. I have a German daughter now.
Mm. Nice.
So I think German is kind of an essential part of my life. And it's not too dissimilar to English in some ways. That anybody who knows German will know there are some very specific points that you need to understand grammatically.
Mm.
But on top of that, it's not too bad. I've got there in the end.
Yeah, I remember I did German. Well, I had to do German at I think it was secondary school for a year or so, and I couldn't remember. I couldn't tell you anything about it, to be honest, Rob. But is there any kind of, obviously you were immersed in there, and you mentioned kind of your wife's German as well. But is there any kind of tools that you found useful for learning? Did you do lessons? Just because I'm sure other analysts might be interested to pick up another language. So
Well, 100%. I would say just in general, if you come and try and coach in Germany, as much as the fact that most people speak English here,
mm.
that they want to speak German when speaking about football,
Yeah.
and probably for good reason, because it's a very detailed language,
Mm.
specifically when it comes to football. We had this topic the other day. One of the main ways in which I kind of became football literate in German, I would say, is by translating a lot of what was already there in German with an Impect into English, and it became abundantly clear to me that we just didn't have terms for most of these things. We created a metric the other day in German. It's called the Eröffnungsball, which essentially is it's the opening ball, we've dubbed it, and I guess that's the literal translation. But it's the first time you try and break a line or play the ball forward in your build-up. They've got so many little nuanced words that kind of describe things within football, which makes me kind of jealous. But I guess it's almost stereotypically German. But in terms of learning the entire language, I went to a school here in Germany to learn it as quickly as possible to try and help me out on the journey. And it's always very nice when my wife also speaks to me in German, usually when I've done something wrong. Allows me to understand local dialect as well.
Nice, perfect. Well, listen, Rob, thanks very much for your time. Really enjoyed that. So hopefully people can check out the links down below, and I'll catch up with you soon, Rob.
Thanks, Chris.